On February 15, 1942, an exhausted British lieutenant general walked along a dusty road in Singapore, carrying a white flag. He was on his way to surrender an army of 80,000 men to a Japanese force half that size. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. But this was more than just a lost battle. This was the moment the myth of European invincibility shattered into a million pieces. The moment the sun finally began to set on the British Empire. To understand how the impregnable Gibraltar of the East fell so quickly, we have to step back. In the 1920s and 30s, the British Empire was stretched dangerously thin. To protect their vast holdings in the Far East, military planners devised the Singapore strategy. They poured millions of pounds into transforming the small, tropical island at the tip of the Malayan Peninsula into the ultimate naval fortress. It featured massive dry docks, an intricate network of anti-aircraft guns, and formidable coastal artillery boasting 15-inch shells. It was designed to hold out against any siege until a grand rescue fleet could sail from Britain. There was just one problem. By 1939, Britain was fighting for its very survival against Nazi Germany. There was no grand fleet left to send. Furthermore, the fortress of Singapore had a fatal flaw. Its planners had assumed that any attack would naturally come from the sea. They looked at the dense, sweltering, mountainous jungles of the Malayan Peninsula to the north and declared them completely impassable to modern armies. It was an assumption bred from a dangerous mixture of complacency and colonial arrogance, an assumption the Japanese Imperial Army was about to brutally test. By late 1941, the drums of war were beating loudly across the Pacific. The United States had embargoed oil to Japan, and the Japanese war machine, desperate for resources, was looking south to the rubber and oil-rich territories of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. To take them, they had to neutralize the fortress of Singapore. The British response to this looming threat was a masterclass in too little, too late. Churchill dispatched Force Z, a tiny naval detachment centered around the modern battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the aging battlecruiser HMS Repulse. They arrived in Singapore without aircraft carrier support. The British command still firmly believed the mere presence of these mighty dreadnoughts would intimidate the Japanese into staying home. But the rules of naval warfare had fundamentally changed, and the British were about to learn that lesson in blood. On December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops stormed the beaches of northern Malaya. The defense of the peninsula fell to Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, a cautious, conventional officer, facing an enemy that played by entirely different rules. The Japanese commander, General Yamashita, led a hardened veteran force that had spent years fighting grueling campaigns in China. They didn't view the Malayan jungle as a barrier, they viewed it as a highway. Yamashita's troops moved with terrifying, relentless speed. They commandeered thousands of local bicycles, outflanking heavy British roadblocks by quietly riding through the rubber plantations. When the tires blew out in the tropical heat, they rode on the steel rims. The clatter of metal on asphalt sounded like rolling tanks in the dense foliage, sending waves of panic through the retreating British, Indian, and Australian ranks. Desperate to halt the invasion, the British sent Force Z north to intercept the Japanese transport ships. It was a suicide mission. On December 10th, swarms of Japanese land-based torpedo bombers descended on the British ships. Without fighter protection, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were sitting ducks. Within hours, both steel leviathans were at the bottom of the South China Sea, taking hundreds of sailors with them. The pride of the Royal Navy was gone. Singapore was now totally exposed from the water, and the British forces on land were trapped in a relentless, nightmarish retreat. For 2 grueling months, the Malayan campaign was a story of British miscalculation and Japanese tactical brilliance. The Allied forces actually outnumbered the Japanese invaders, but they were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and desperately lacking in air support. The few Brewster Buffalo fighter planes defending the skies were hopelessly outclassed by the nimble Japanese Zeros. On the ground, Yamashita utilized light tanks, which the British didn't possess, having believed them completely useless in jungle terrain. The Japanese simply drove them down the paved roads, smashing through defensive lines. Time and time again, Percival's forces would set up a defense, only for the Japanese to slip through the jungle or launch amphibious flanking maneuvers down the coast, forcing yet another chaotic withdrawal. Morale plummeted. The retreat became a rout. By January 31st, 1942, the last Allied troops crossed the causeway linking Malaya to the island of Singapore. They blew a massive hole in the bridge behind them, hoping to buy time. But time had run out. Singapore was now packed with 1 million terrified civilians and an army of exhausted, demoralized soldiers. It is here that one of the greatest myths of the Second World War was born. The idea that Singapore's massive coastal guns were pointed the wrong way out to sea and couldn't be turned around to fire on the invading Japanese. The truth is actually far more tragic. Most of the massive guns could easily rotate to fire inland. The problem was the ammunition. The magazines were heavily stocked with armor-piercing shells, designed to punch through the hulls of battleships. When fired into the jungle, these massive shells simply buried themselves deep in the soft Malayan mud without exploding. The British had almost no high-explosive shells to use against infantry. On February 8th, Yamashita launched his final assault across the Johor Strait. Under the cover of darkness and a deafening artillery barrage, Japanese troops swarmed the island's northwestern coast, hitting the thinly stretched, exhausted Australian 22nd Brigade. The defense crumbled. Within days, the Japanese had captured the island's crucial reservoirs, cutting off the main water supply. To the overflowing, burning city, artillery shells rained down on civilian neighborhoods without mercy. Hospitals were bombed, the streets were filled with rubble, fire, and the cries of the dying. The situation was apocalyptic. Back in London, Winston Churchill issued a draconian order. "The city must be defended to the absolute last," he wrote to his commanders. "Commanders and senior officers should die with their troops. The honor of the British Empire is at stake." But Churchill was sitting in a bunker in London, not a burning, besieged city in the tropics. General Percival had to look at the grim reality on the ground. His men were out of water, out of fuel, and almost out of ammunition. Epidemics were threatening to sweep through the densely packed civilian population. To fight on would not be a heroic last stand. It would be a senseless, bloody massacre. And so, on February 15th, the first day of the Chinese New Year, Percival made the agonizing decision to capitulate. The footage of Percival, tall, gaunt, clad in oversized shorts and a tin helmet, marching under Japanese escort to the Ford Motor Factory to sign the unconditional surrender, became one of the defining images of the 20th century. It was the ultimate crushing humiliation. The nightmare, however, was only just beginning. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops marched into captivity. They would face unimaginable horrors in the years to come, dying by the thousands from disease, starvation, and execution in the brutal conditions of Changi Prison and along the infamous Death Railway in Burma. But the civilian population of Singapore suffered a darker, more immediate fate. In the weeks following the surrender, the Japanese secret police, the Kempitai, carried out the Sukching massacre, systematically screening and executing tens of thousands of ethnic Chinese men they suspected of being anti-Japanese. The fall of Singapore was not merely a military defeat. It was a geopolitical earthquake that permanently realigned the global order. For centuries, the British Empire had maintained control over its vast Asian colonies through the powerful illusion of innate superiority and untouchable military might. That illusion was destroyed in 70 days by men riding bicycles. The psychological shockwaves were profound and permanent. Australia, realizing with horror that the mother country could no longer protect it, permanently turned its geopolitical allegiance away from London and toward the United States. Indian nationalists watched their colonial masters humbled, massively accelerating the push for an independent India. When the British finally returned to Singapore at the end of the war in 1945, they did not return as invincible conquerors, but as vulnerable, flawed administrators living on borrowed time. The fortress that was supposed to stand for 1,000 years fell in just over 2 months. It was a tragedy of hubris, a catastrophic failure of imagination, and a devastating lesson in the cost of underestimating your enemy. The surrender of Singapore proved that empires are not permanent structures of stone and steel, but fragile agreements of perception and power. And once that perception is broken, it can never be put back together. The echoes of that single decision would shape the next century of history, effectively closing the book on the age of European empires in the East. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe for more forgotten chapters of history.